Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jerry Alt. I wanted to take a few minutes this afternoon and talk to you about macro lenses. Rather than go into specific images and show you editing techniques, I've shot a few images with two different lenses here, and I want to talk to you a little more generally about the pros and cons of using a macro lens. So if you take a look here, I put a nickel, and we all know what size a nickel is, into a clamp, and you can see here that it's a little bit bigger. Even at a 1:1, it's a little bit bigger than you would expect that nickel to be in real life. But what I wanted to do is work from a reasonable working distance and then focus that lens in. So basically at the, this is a 50 millimeter Canon close-up macro lens. It's not the L series, the top end lens, but it's fairly affordable. I then added a macro extension tube to it, also a Canon brand, so that at this size, basically I was able to focus without kicking in the extension, if you will, built into that lens to increase the magnification. So I'm shooting at 1:1 ratio, meaning that the image I got back was basically what was being seen through the lens on the sensor. And I'll get back to talking about ratios again in a couple of minutes. So in the Canon line, and it's going to be different for the different brands of camera, but I shoot primarily Canon, so I'm going to talk about that. The 50 mil is pretty much your entry-level macro lens for someone who wants to go out and take pictures of flowers or bees or butterflies or whatnot. It's a lot easier to take pictures of flowers because they won't fly away. But one of the reasons that you would want to do this is that you can get in closer and get more detail typically than you could with a standard lens. If you were using a standard 50 millimeter lens, the minimum focus distance might be closer to a foot, maybe a little bit farther than that. So if you're a foot away using a what would be called a regular lens, you're not going to get that level of detail. What you really want to do with a macro is be able to zoom into the detail on your subject. And I'll talk about flowers, but we're getting back here to the nickel in a moment. One of the trade-offs generally that you have with macro lenses is while you can, in essence, magnify, you're not actually using it like a magnifying glass, but the lenses have built into them a ratio. If a normal lens is going to shoot maybe, 1:2 ratio, because if you've ever tried to use a 50 millimeter lens and shoot a person from head to toe, you can do that if you get far enough away. But there's going to be a minimum distance that you can get from your subject before you can no longer focus. And that's because of the length of the barrel of the lens, the placement of the actual lens elements, and the overall distance from the front element to the sensor in your camera. The reason I put an extension tube on this 50 millimeter is knowing that I wanted to get close, and I was then comparing it to a much more limited lens, which is the pretty high-end and expensive Canon 65 millimeter manual macro lens. That has kind of a different problem, is that if you get very far away from your subject, you just can't focus at all. It'd be like having reader glasses, the cheaters that you can buy at Walgreens, and then trying to read something from across the street because it's meant to focus close in. And with that 65 millimeter, I'll tell you, I spent too much money on it. I got it at a time when it was more important to me to understand the characteristics of macro. It's really got limited purposes, and it's very, very difficult to use because it's manual focus. That being said, so that is why I wouldn't end up recommending that any of you get that 65 millimeter. Now, if you go the other way, depending on what kind of camera system, you might find a 65 millimeter or an 80 millimeter. I know on Nikon, they've got a beautiful 105 millimeter macro lens. What happens as you go up in overall size, and then there's, I think, a 180 millimeter. I know for Canon, it may be the same for Nikon. It's really kind of a telephoto lens with the macro characteristics built in, meaning that it has a magnification factor in it. So when you look at something like the 100 millimeter that has a 1-to-1 magnification, you are getting a bigger image. Like you see here at 100% on the 50 millimeter, you're seeing the coin a little bit bigger than it would be in real life. With the 100 millimeter, you would likewise get a bigger starting image showing up on your sensor. But the problem with 100 millimeter is you can't get as close as you can with a 50 or with the 65. With the 180, you may have to be a couple of feet away or 3 feet away. I don't remember offhand. I measured this at one point, but there is a minimum focusing distance. It makes up for that in the fact that it is a longer lens, so you're going to get more detail anyway. You would use the 100 if you're going to shoot maybe butterflies and you want to get some realistic photos of them, but you can't get too close because they'll move. With the 180, I was able to successfully get macro shots of dragonflies from 3 or 4 feet away and have plenty of individual detail on them. So let's talk about what macros do in general. So this is 1-to-1. If I jump ahead, this is a 2-to-1, meaning that with that 50 millimeter lens, I actually came inside that quote unquote minimum focus distance. And because of the extension tube, I was able to blow up the image so that you can see closer. You're not getting really that much more detail. You're just seeing a bigger image, which gives you, more ability to zoom in and actually work with it. So that's let's see, this was 2-to-1. And then this, or either of these, this is a better image. This is a 4-to-1, which is the maximum that I could get with that 50 millimeter. At this point, the very front, now as I zoom in, there's a barrel within the barrel, if you will, on the lens, and so it actually extends forward. And at that full extended 1-to-4 or 4-to-1 ratio, meaning that the image is 4 times actual size at that focus point, the tip of the barrel of the lens, the front of the lens, was about 3.5 or 3 3/4 inches away from the nickel. So you can imagine, in the same way that if you got closer with a magnifying glass to an object, it starts getting bigger, you do actually get this magnification. This is great if you want to do this, and again, with subjects that aren't going to fly away. You can see here on this image the incredible detail that we're seeing. Now, this is a 2005 nickel. It's probably been around the world, thousands of times, and I intentionally got something that had some characteristic. A brand new, just minted coin wouldn't have these kind of indentations in it, scratch marks in the chin. There's a little piece here on the nose. We're going to get to that in a minute, but you can see the kind of scratches, and that's because change by its very nature goes through machines, rattles around in your pocket, sits in the glove box of your car, wherever it may be, until you dig it out and use it. So these coins are made pretty durable. So one of the things that you'll see about this is that the raised details with the 50 millimeter in the nose are pretty much as sharp as they are on the back where the ear would be. They're pretty much as sharp on the edge of the coin, and take a look at a nickel, see how far away that is. You've got a fair amount of detail throughout. Now, as you get farther away from that, right at the very edge, away from the camera, it starts to go out of focus. Some of that's probably because I didn't take the time to perfectly align this small object and perfectly align it to the flat front of the lens, but you get a pretty good idea here. So this would be great for seeing the kind of detail. If you want to take ring shots at a wedding and you don't want to pop $1,000 or more for the 100mm L series macro lens, then you can do pretty good with buying this lens. Let's now, I want you to take a look here at what's showing up around this nose. And I'm going to go up a step to the 65mm. The 65mm, here's that same nose, okay? The problem with the 65mm is it's got a very, very shallow, I mean extremely shallow depth of field. It also, as I said earlier, has to be focused from a very close distance. At this point, where I was at 5:1, meaning this is magnified 5 times bigger than the original size in the sensor, I was under 2 inches away. I was about 1 5/8 inches away from the face of this nickel with the front of that lens. If you need to get extreme detail, if you were taking photographs, for instance, of integrated circuits on a computer board, or if you wanted to see the detail in a stamp, which is going to be perfectly flat, right? But you want to see the detail, the fibers and whatever. This is a great lens for doing that kind of thing. It has very little functionality in the real world, and here's why. Oops, if I come back out on this, I'm going to say that these marks on the front of the nose are where I had my focus point. And you can see, because I'm half blind anyway, but I had to find a focus point manually adjusting this. If I had been doing true remote shooting and I had been running this through a computer monitor, I might have a 30-inch image to look at and I could fine-tune that adjustment. But because the plane that's in focus is so small, so thin, even when I focused it and then let go of the focusing ring, it went slightly out of focus. I was shooting on a camera stand, which was heavy and solid, but still you got a little bit out of focus. So I wouldn't say that this is perfect, but good enough for my demonstration purposes. But as we go away from, unlike the 50mm, as we go away from this center point, from where this focus is, and travel up toward the eye, right, it's more or less on the same focal plane. But the other problem you have with the 65, the nature of that lens, is that you get extreme bokeh, meaning anything at the edge of the field of view is going to start to go out of focus. We can see that perhaps best in this image of the edge of the coin. And if I thought to get a dime that has the little ridges on the edge, I tried to shoot the edges of this nickel, but they don't have ridges, and so it wasn't going to show me anything. A dime or a quarter would have worked better for that. But if I pull this in, I would say that my focus point was probably right here, right around the front of the letter E. It looks to be in pretty good focus here, right on the body of the E. But if I go just to the very next letter, see how out of focus it is? That's the problem with this lens. The bokeh is going to kill you in trying to take pictures. So unless you want some extreme amount of detail on a very, very limited area, this isn't going to be a suitable lens. The 50, on the other hand, when we went back to that, okay, if I was to come over to the letters and then let me see if I'll magnify that to 3:1 anyway. Okay, you can see that the letters next, the adjacent letters, are still relatively in focus one to the other, okay? I was focused in all of these. I have my focus point on the nose because that's protruding from the front of the coin. But even all the way around, you see, once I get out to the edge of the coin, the farthest I can from that plane of focus, I am starting to see some out of focus areas. That's the effect of bokeh. So the advantage of using a longer lens, like a 100mm, which is my favorite go-to lens that I take to weddings, the advantage of using the 100mm is that it doesn't have that extreme bokeh at the edges of the lens for most of the things I'm going to do. I could shoot this coin with the 100 millimeter and I would find pretty good detail from the top of the coin to the bottom of the coin. Now I did try to do a couple of 3D examples just to give you an idea of the capabilities. So let's look at this for a moment. So what I shot, let me go back away from this for a second. I shot a Matchbox car. Now Matchbox cars are $1 a piece. I got this at the Dollar Tree, picked up 2 or 3 of them thinking that I would do something with tilt shift, and I will probably come back and do some tilt shift stuff, talk to you about the times and places to use a tilt shift lens, but they're pretty cheaply built. They're $1, right? I'm sorry, not even Matchbox. Matchbox has higher quality. These are Hot Wheels cars. So maybe they were 79 cents, I don't know. But they're just, you know, put out by the hundreds and the thousands. There's not a lot of, this is the 50 millimeter lens. You can see that even with good detail, I'm not getting, you know, good printing, the quality, and this is straight out of the box. So this isn't worn, this wasn't run through the sand by a kid. This is the way it comes, brand new. And it, you know, if you had your car painted like this, you'd take it back and want a refund, right? But this is how it comes. And you can see it's really rough, okay, here in the plastic. Well, I took this car and used the 65 millimeter lens and magnified it. So if you were looking for flaws in integrated circuits, this would be great. Now this is 5:1 begin with, and now I did it 3 times, so I'm going to bring it back down to 1:1 in Lightroom. But look how crappy this construction was. I mean, basically this is blown into a mold, probably making 1,000 of these an hour, chung 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 chung, and they're spitting back out. And so you don't expect much quality for this. This wouldn't be the kind of thing you would generally use this for. I took a shot on the fender using the same 5:1. There is a spot of focus right here, but within what, a half an inch or an inch, because it's a curved surface, I'm completely out of focus. Not a very useful lens for what I want to do. On the other hand, if I go to my last image, the one that I started showing you, I mean, this is the one thing about the 50 millimeter, and again, my lens is probably 8 inches away at this point because I want to pick up more of the car. Okay, but I was able to, number one, focus at this point. The 50 mil will let me focus that far out. I got more of the detail of the car, but I've also got a lot more of my frame in focus. So, to recap, just because you can get closer with a macro doesn't mean it's the right way to get detail. When you get to that 65 millimeter manual focus lens, which my recollection was it was well over $1,000, it's got almost no use in your arsenal for day-to-day work, whether you're a hobbyist or whether you're shooting as a professional. The 50 millimeter gives you the ability to get a little bit better, but you're still going to get the bokeh. So I would encourage you to get a 100 millimeter or a 150 or a 180, whatever's available in your brand of camera, and then consider adding extension rings to it. Now, I'm going to do some additional live sessions, and I'm going to record them where I'm going to show shooting the macro, how to get light on your subject with a macro, how to add backgrounds and add your own bokeh. In general, a telephoto lens compresses the image, which means more of it's going to appear to be in focus. If you shoot a telephoto lens along a far distance, shooting at a zoo, shooting people playing in a field, you're going to get a lot more of that in focus around. There will be some bokeh in the far back. There will be some bokeh in the front. But the combination of using a higher aperture, an f11, by the way, these were all shot at f10. So I had pretty good aperture on this, But for me to get any more depth of field on that 50 millimeter, I would have probably had to go to f16 or f18, and at that point I would have had to blow in a lot more light to be able to get the detail. So save your money on buying the gimmicky macro lenses. Buy a decent lens, and then think about getting extension tubes. Why extension tubes? When you add an extension tube, it artificially moves the lens farther away from the body. You screw it onto the back of the lens, then you screw that into the camera. It brings the lens closer to your subject, and then within limits, it doesn't have any glass in it, by the way, so it won't do anything but change the distance. It makes the camera think that you're farther away than you are. Think of it that way. I want to move the lens in, but I get inside the minimum focus distance. If I add an extension tube, or 2 extension tubes, or 3 extension tubes, and I get that camera really much closer, then the light, if I have enough light, it's going to still reach the sensor. It's going to think that it was where it was originally on the camera without the extension tubes in place, but you've managed to get closer and therefore get a more detailed photo. All right, that's it for today. Probably confused you more than I helped, but that's okay. Feel free to leave comments or questions. You can send questions to me on my Facebook page at Alt Imagery, or to my Instagram at Alt Imagery. And if you enjoyed this content, please like it and consider subscribing so that you're notified of future tutorials. Have a great day.